we are going to be joined by 3 experts in the field of AI and ethics to discuss the geopolitics of AI technologies, ethical concerns, risks, and global challenges. We are going to speak with co-founder of DataEthics.eu, Gree, you're going to tell us, we've heard conflicting, Gree Hasselbalch, then the professor of law, ethics, and informatics in the law school and School of Computer Science at the University of Birmingham, Karen Yeung. And both Gree and Karen are also members of the European Union's high-level expert group on artificial intelligence. And then thirdly,
calling in from San Francisco, and so the middle of the night there, please reward this man for his fortitude. Martin Rauchbauer, who is the first Austrian tech ambassador to Silicon Valley and a board member of The Grid, which you will hear much more about in the later session today.
So the way we're going to organize this is that we will first ask each of the panelists to speak about the core. Oh, hi, Martin. Wow, middle of the night. Okay, so we will first ask each of the panelists to speak about the core focus of their work, and then we will open the stage to all panelists for a round or 2 of questions. Let's begin with Gree. And Gree, do you say Gree or Grey? We had a big debate over this.
There, I found a button. Gree.
Okay, it's Gree. It is Gree.
The Scandinavian version or the Danish version, it's Gry.
Grouche. Okay. Well, I'm sure we'll butcher that, but
it's fine. It's fine.
So we're speaking to Gree, who is a co-founder of DataEthics.eu and also a member of the high-level expert group on AI for the EU. We'll hand the digital stage over to you before we then come back to Karen and Martin. We'll see you guys in a little bit. But maybe to start, could you just tell us a bit about the genesis of DataEthics.eu and what circumstances compelled you to first found the initiative and let people know what it's about?
Yes, I can. So DataEthics.eu, we're a think tank, a non-profit think tank that works. We were established in 2015, and we work to kind of support this kind of alternative business movement mostly, but also kind of movement in changing the data practices of creating these kind of data ecosystems and infrastructures, not only for AI, but for the digital technologies in general. So, but in general, so my work is like centered in 3 areas. I've been working academically and in policy, and also in with advocacy for many years now. But DataEthics.eu, it came out of this kind of moment we probably all remember at the time in 2013, the first kind of time anyone who wasn't a foundation or an original privacy activist or anything, they didn't really discover what was going on until 2013, when Snowden, his revelations came out with this big kind of mass surveillance system, where we had the intertwinement of this kind of state surveillance with a kind of industrial form of surveillance capitalism. And around this time, we kind of started having a popular movement. People were starting to reacting, and they were starting getting nervous and changing their way of doing things. And some original kind of businesses also started around that time, and also in connection with the negotiation of the GDPR, started to kind of address those concerns, and not only as kind of this activist topic, but more as a kind of, this is probably going to be sound business practice. Me and my co-founders, actually originally we wrote a book about this movement, and originally we all worked with this kind of activist environment, and went to these debates where we always had to kind of argue with these business people who were telling us that, you know, privacy is an obstacle to innovation. It's just, you know, you're an old-fashioned dinosaur if you're even concerned with it. You know, in the future, privacy is no longer a social norm. That was the key thing. But we realized that slowly, you know, people were changing. There were a few very smart technology activists who, at that time, they were called activists and they were called tech revolutionaries. Today, they're just called people with good business practices, but they were kind of starting to jump on this movement. And we, of course, as kind of the traditional activists, we were thinking, oh, well, so, there's someone changing these things from the bottom up, people that are changing their practices in terms of how they deal with data ethically, and so we need to support this movement. So that was basically the history of how data ethics started. And that's also what we're doing today. So we've been trying to provide concrete tools for kind of this alternative business movement, but also a movement that is moving into institutions and kind of the more design environment, where you consider data as not only something you can grab as much as you can and exploit it, and then at the same time develop a kind of ecosystem, infringing rights and thriving on exploitation of personal data, but you can actually create data that is both good for business, but also fundamentally good for democracy and people. So we have like a set of principles, and I think, am I talking too much?
No, I was just going to ask you to say that, actually. Perfect.
Okay, so no, so we do have a set of principles, and basically our principles is, we do call them data ethical principles, but they do have a very strong foundation in the fundamental rights framework of Europe, and also in the GDPR. So we do have concerns and thinking of the compliance with the legal framework as a basis. But fundamentally, I think I'm not going to mention all the principles. I think the key principle that I would like to put forward, that kind of where all the principles streams from, is this idea of the human in the center. And there's nothing, everyone is concerned and talking about this right now, but the way we're defining it is that you have the primary interest of the human over others' interests. So when you design a data technology, you'll have or if you are conducting a piece of science where you need the data, you always have to consider first and foremost the primacy of the human being, and not all kinds of other interests in that. And this is kind of also a fundamental, it's not our principle, it's a fundamental principle of the Bioethics Convention of the Council of Europe and these things. So there's clearly a very cultural, maybe a cultural bias of what we're doing. The other thing about this approach is also, now we heard before mentioning the history of AI that comes out of this kind of cybernetic approach, which is basically a very particular understanding of not only what AI and these kind of AI technologies are, or what machines are for us, because when the cybernetic kind of perspective was created, there wasn't anything called AI at that time. But it also says something about who we are as humans. So, when we are creating an AI technology and we're trying to make sense out of a lot of messy human biology and messy human social relations, we also have to cut out some things that are very fundamentally human. That is exactly the unpredictability and the mess of the human biology. And kind of our standpoint is very much saying that there's cases where you can use this pragmatically, but there's also cases and moments where you cannot transfer the human messiness into a data system. And actually there'll be times when we have these kind of quantification and datification of the human being that has very problematic ethical implications, and those are the kind of the starting points we have to think of. So decisions that are based on classifications that are biased, or decisions that are based on people that are classified according to their postal code rather than who they are, and all these kind of things. So there's a fundamental kind of idea that is also responding to this cybernetic moment of AI.
Yes.
I'm going to just stay on that.
Super. Okay, thank you. That was a very good basis for this human-centered idea of AI, and that maybe when we think about what a particularly European relationship to an AI framework would be, it would put the human at the center. I want to now move to, I think we'll have everybody introduce their projects first, and then to Karen Yeung, who is Professor of Law, Ethics, and Informatics in the Law School and School of Computer Science at the University of Birmingham. Karen, welcome welcome. You look very warm.
You can't see my feet.
True. You can't see my feet. I have unwarm slippers too. Oh yes, the magic of Zoom. All you need is from the waist up, right?
Exactly.
I wondered, could you maybe give us a brief outline of what your focus is right now? I think what we'll do is we will keep these introductions relatively brief, just a couple of minutes, so that we can speak more synthetically across all three of your areas of expertise.
Sure. So thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And as I understand, the focus of the panel is what's distinctive about Europe in terms of these ongoing debates about AI and the need for a governance framework in relation to AI. And I guess I came to the general field as someone who had been interested in the governance of emerging technologies more generally. And I guess in the last 10 years, it soon became apparent that computers were taking over the world. So as a result, I started to focus more, and to be perfectly honest, and I'm a bit embarrassed to say this, when the internet first came out, I just couldn't get that excited. You know, it was just about chat. You could chat to somebody remotely, and that was nice, and it was certainly cheaper than a phone call, but not that exciting. And then we have the data explosion, we have advances in machine learning, and basically digital technologies are starting to do some really cool and very powerful things, and they're starting to change the world, and this transformation has happened really incredibly rapidly. And I guess one of the things that I've observed in the last few years is originally Silicon Valley and the tech industry portrayed themselves as something, as Morozov puts it, equivalent to kind of global charities, that they were all working to make the world a better place, and hey, you know, let's all celebrate. So it was a very singular focus on all the fantastic, convenient, efficient stuff that these machine learning technologies would enable us to do. And it was really easy to get excited about the potential here. And only slowly did we start to see that maybe all the glitters is not gold. And the Snowden revelations were quite important in demonstrating just how seriously our privacy could be compromised. But increasingly, in particular, in terms of social media content and content distribution, and how that has affected social practice and the public sphere, and then of course the way in which it has potentially undermined democratic processes, we've become much more aware of the adverse impacts that AI applications can have, many of which are unintentional, but nonetheless, because they can operate rapidly and at scale, they present really challenging, serious social problems that we are still in the midst of grappling with. So at the moment, there is a lot of ongoing discussion at the policy level, at the national, regional, and international level about how do we govern these technologies responsibly. So the debate has moved on from whether we should do anything, and initially the tech industry was very resistant, saying, no, you'll ruin innovation, you know, we're all just pure creativity and great stuff, to kind of conceding that maybe, okay, maybe some constraints might be appropriate. And so there is still, however, everything to play for. Is intensely political debate between those who have a lot to lose if there are any restrictions on their freedom to do as they please. But at the same time, we see very foundational institutions of democratic, free, human rights respecting societies also at stake. So this is still ongoing. I'm really fascinated by Catherine's introduction to where the state of the art is, and I wasn't aware of some of the challenges which the latest technologies are posing to questions about data as a resource, as a common resource, rather than something that is owned personally and can be monetized. So much of the discussion about data governance is, oh, if we just allow you to own your data and get paid micropayments, we'll solve the problems. No, much more complicated than that. But we still haven't really been able to solve the data governance challenge. And it strikes me that these debates will intensify even more as the technologies become more powerful. Thank you.
Absolutely. That's a super fascinating question. And also, on the other hand, when we think about the loss of jobs and we think about how people will generate an income, there are some obvious correlations that are deeply complex to sort out. So we'll come back to those questions in the question section. But now a very perfect bridge to Martin Rauchbauer in the middle of the night in San Francisco. Martin is the first ever Austrian tech ambassador to Silicon Valley. And so maybe because of some of the points that Karen just mentioned, a kind of tech diplomacy is ever more urgent. Maybe you could, I should also say, Martin is, as we mentioned earlier, a board member of the Grid. You're going to hear a lot more about the Grid this evening in Berlin, the proper morning in California. But I think first I'd be interested to know from Martin, what is this role of a tech ambassador? How was it conceived? And what do you imagine that role providing for the international community?
Well, good morning from usually sunny California, but not at 4 o'clock in the morning where it's still dark here in San Francisco. And good afternoon to you in Europe. Yes, in tech diplomacy is kind of an emerging field, and it's really, as you just mentioned, a reaction to the developments in the tech industry. If you think of the context where I, as a European diplomat, operate here in Silicon Valley. I've been posted here as already now for 4 years. There's been exactly this kind of change that Karen outlined before. So Silicon Valley was really, when I came here in 2016, all about we are going to change the world, and certainly governments are not to interfere. The big mantra of Silicon Valley was about self-regulation, and this changed very dramatically when the global tech industry encountered many of the differences. I think one of the watershed years was clearly 2 years ago, if we just think of the Cambridge Analytica scandal that broke out, and a CEO of Facebook had to face a lot of critical questions of lawmakers, both in the United States and in Europe. And increasingly, even the big internet platforms come to governments and ask them almost to be regulated, because so many of the problems that they are encountering, they have a feeling, or they say at least publicly, that they cannot really regulate themselves. So tech diplomacy is a little bit like traditional diplomacy, talking to companies, to enterprises, and they're not just the big tech companies that we always talk about, but also to smaller companies, to small and medium-sized enterprises, of which Europe, of course, has a lot, to startups, how regulation affects them, how the non-regulation affects them. And we here in Silicon Valley, as European representations, we look, of course, of ways of presenting a European outlook, our European values to our counterparts here in Silicon Valley. And some of the ways in which we engage have to do with artificial intelligence as well. It have to do with data protection. In 2018 was, of course, also the year that the General Data Protection Regulation went into force in Europe, and it had global repercussions. And here in Silicon Valley, which is, of course, a part of California, it led to a very specific Californian privacy legislation that at first became the California Consumer and Privacy Act. It just recently, at the recent election, was upgraded to a very European style of data protection regime. So it matters, those things matter. What happens in Brussels does not only matter within the European Union, but can have global repercussions. And the other way we engage with tech diplomacy here as Europeans is, in fact, arts and culture, and that is the GRID project, of which we're going to talk later tonight.
Super. Thank you, Martin. That was very interesting, and now great. So we have Gri and Karen also back on stage. I have some questions, or do you want to start with one?
You can begin.
Okay, so I was going to start with something more general, but actually I think it would be better to do something more specific. This is actually one of your questions, but and I will just say again, oh yes, good. Well, actually, let's start first with one from the audience, and then we will fill in. So we have a question from Stefanos Valianatos. He says, such an extremely interesting debate on threats to democracy and the balance between governing technology and the freedom of R&D of those relevant companies seems to me that is applicable and relevant to the community of states that are very sensitive and responsible in relation to human rights, etc. But how can that evolve effectively when, on the other hand, there are technologically advanced states which show less respect to such a threat, and primarily only when they, as states' apparatuses, do not own such companies? Yes, this is very much in line with what we're also interested in asking you. So you have China, or you have, the US to some capacity, with very different kind of ethical barometers than maybe Europe is trying to promote.
I think also there's this, I guess almost like a trope of whoever wins the race of AI supremacy wins the world.
Exactly.
So is it, there's certain countries, states, I imagine, approaching it almost as if it was a military program.
Absolutely. And so we can hear in this, nice formal format of like cultural relations, we can talk about what should happen and keeping the human centered and how important that is ideologically, but we know exactly whoever wins the AI race ends up winning what these rules are going to be. So
the story goes.
So the story goes.
There might be some pushback against that as well, right?
So how do you guys each, how do you each negotiate this, this very, very complex spectrum? Who would like to go first?
I've heard this a lot, and I have my own fairly strident views on this particular trope, if you don't mind me calling it a trope, that whoever wins the AI war is going to rule the world. And that's why, so the argument goes, so Europe really needs to push back against regulation because we're just going to lose out. And the Chinese, with no scruples, so the trope goes, they're going to win, and we're going to become basically pawns in this whole global show. So don't regulate us. No, that's going to be disaster, right? So that's the trope. Now, my response to this, in many ways, I'll give you the simplistic version, and then I'll give you the more advanced version. And when I hear this, that we can't possibly regulate here in Europe because China will get ahead, and look what they're doing, is to point out something that I point out often to my children, which is just because somebody else does it does not make it right. So that means we have to decide how we want to live, what we are committed to as a European community, and then stick to our guns. And that means, though, policing those norms. It means if some particular application that has been created somewhere else on the basis of data that has been collected in breach of privacy standards that we consider to be fundamental, then we don't allow it to be used here. Now, I totally accept that practical enforcement is difficult, but I see this happening already in the medical sphere. So attempts are being made to take medical models that have been trained on Chinese patient data without respect for privacy to be used here in Europe. And there's a question about, well, if that hasn't been made in accordance with our standards, then we can't actually be seen to be supporting that if we're going to be true to what we believe in. So I actually think that we need to decide how we want to live, what's important to us, and then be serious about living those principles. And if other countries want to live in a different way, that's kind of fine, but we don't have to copy that. And so I think in the military sphere, there definitely needs to be some international agreement on basic thresholds of acceptability. That is a global political question I don't think we can resolve simply by policing our own borders, because that's the nature of warfare. But in other domains, in other social applications, I do think it's really up to us to decide how we want to live collectively, and then to commit ourselves to doing that.
And a follow-up question to that would just be, okay, so that may make sense for Europe, the US, China, Russia, these global powers, but what then happens to countries that are that have more informal leadership, or that have weaker leadership, or less stable leadership? You could imagine the Venezuela, you could imagine the Sudan, you could imagine in areas which, of course, given Belt and Road, are very much of interest as pawns in some global proxy power war, or
Sure.
the Caucasus. So how then do we account, or do we nudge? Yes, what then happens to these countries?
Well, I mean, that's
a bigger question.
A very, very hard problem. I'll be honest, I don't see that the challenges are idiosyncratic in relation to AI. So we've always had this problem in global politics. The trouble is we have much more porous open borders now. Well, leaving aside COVID. And so that those political challenges and equity challenges intensify, but I don't see them as necessarily AI specific. So it's a more general problem of global politics that we have. And I definitely don't have answers to that, I'm afraid.
Would Martin or Agree, would you like to weigh in on this question in your respective capacities? And also this question, I want to add one vector to it, maybe. So then what happens to the cosmopolitan tech entrepreneur or the student who wants to study in Shenzhen and also San Francisco and maybe has a base in Paris? What happens to these global figures that were so prized in the early aughts as we had this millennial aspirations of global unity?
Well, that's a very good question. In fact, we have I've met actually quite a number of these aspirational kind of entrepreneurs. You know, come with a great idea, an AI-based idea, maybe to Silicon Valley, and want to in some way, scale it up and turn it into a global success story. And it's interesting that increasing, these geopolitical considerations and also these considerations about human rights and ethics come into play. That even small companies that have a product that relies on machine learning and artificial intelligence have to very carefully think of to whom they are actually selling and marketing their services and products, because this has, of course, also implications for them and their future growth. I entirely agree with Karen that this kind of a simplistic view of this global race. I mean, some people go even further and say we're actually in the middle of a new Cold War between the United States and China, based on technology, and there's some signs of this competition when you think of the debate of for example, the global infrastructure of 5G technologies and countries that are kind of drawn into one sphere or the other. But of course, from a European point of view, this is not something that we would like to support, this kind of two universes that are increasingly separating. And also I would like to add, from the perspective of a global South, I mean, this access to technologies are increasingly important and could mean on the positive side that AI, of course, is a technology that can be used also for good and can maybe help many of these countries achieve our common sustainable development goals, and can be used in the fight against climate change and hunger and all sorts of kind of problems that we share as a globe. But on the other hand, of course, we have to look at these new technologies as also a source of exploitation, particularly in the global South, and also the digital gap. That there is just a lack of talent, or talent gets drawn to these global ecosystems, and that is particularly tough for many countries in the global South that are, of course, also being targeted in this global competition. So from a European perspective, I think, as Karen said, we need to insist on our values and principles, and also, quite frankly, also on human rights, which are universally agreed legal standards. And there's, for example, a group of countries that particularly look at human rights in the online sphere, the Freedom Online Coalition, where my country, Austria, and most European Union countries are member, and we look here for global partners to enforce global human rights standards around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe this is a good pivot to bring Gri into this question as well. And maybe I'll add, I think we need more than ever a data ethics principles a manifesto, right, that we all, or a contract that we globally sign, but we speak about human-centered technology. But it does seem that in order for humanity to survive, we need to have like ecology-centered technology that sees humans as part of a larger ecosystem, right? And so how do we take stock of the, I mean, you mentioned at the end of your description, also this, and this is something that Catherine was also speaking about, the environmental impact, and how responsible AI is also one that is deeply aware of the energy costs, the ecological impact, the externalities. So we can speak about human-centered AI, but what about also like ecology-centered AI? So how can we speak about that in terms of writing global rules? We know that maybe China will have different ethical principles, especially in their expansionism into Africa and into some of these weaker global South countries. What are your thoughts on that?
There was a lot of questions. No, first of all, I mean, I just want to say that I totally agree with Martin and Karen that the whole idea about this kind of competing space of three forces that are somehow one gonna win over the other, and also in general this kind of simplistic understanding of what technological change actually is, because it's not that simple. It's actually a very complex process, and the last thing is this thing that. It's a complex process, and it's one that we've done before. I mean, this is not a new thing. It's not the first time that we had to negotiate different standards, different systems, different technological cultures and styles, and kind of get them into a system. Someone mentioned, I don't even remember who it was that mentioned at the beginning, the electricity system, that we had the universal electricity system, that somehow we managed to merge these different styles of doing different kinds of science and technology around that, and getting a governance system around it that somehow makes a global space that is interoperable and that we can work together, and at the same time also somehow not only respects people but also the planet. And so for me, I mean, the biggest thing we can do is to think of this as a very simple problem we have to solve. So changing things is like a range of areas we have to look at. We have to look at the practices of the people who build the technologies. We have to think of the standards for the engineers. We have to look at the legal frameworks. We have to look at the education of the people and the ones that are adopting these systems. And then for somehow we have to create a system that is ecological. I think ecological is a really good term in this sense. So I mean, the last thing I would propose was another manifesto. I mean, that's something that came out of not another cyber activist manifesto, but I think that we have to have some kind of shared agreement about what kind of society we want to live in, and that is an agreement that you don't. You get it at different levels. So again, you get it in terms of legal frameworks, you get it in terms of agreements on engineering standards, you get it in terms of shared cultures around how you build a technology. The big data mindset, it didn't come out of anything. It came out of a system, a particular way of building technologies. So that's what we have to build from the bottom and up now, and not just present a manifesto. So.
There's a thread that Gry also you spoke about towards the end of your introductory talk, and it's really about this sort of core idea that everything in human behavior and the world can be modeled in a sort of perfectly predictive or deterministic way. I mean, this is a long-term project going back to cybernetics and the development of behavioral psychology. I mean, there's Project Cybersyn in Chile in the 70s, I believe. OGAS in the Soviet Union, they attempt to build a sort of centralized proto-internet deterministic economic command and control center. I don't believe these projects really worked. But you mentioned this sort of I mean, the vast complexity, the variables, the chaos that's built into human behavior, the sheer complexity. And I wonder if you think on this very core, it's almost a philosophical level, if perhaps a part of ethics in this space is actually pushing back that against that framework or that belief that every system can be modeled, and I wonder if there is a way actually to articulate that, or how, if you feel like this sort of just belief that deterministic or predictive systems can be made for everything, does that figure into ethics, and can that be articulated and pushed back against?
Yes, and in very practical terms. I mean, there's kind of two strands. If to then make things a little bit simplistic, we have two ways of two philosophical strands in this. One is this where we are asking for human control and human command that is translated in different kind of processes, also even down to the idea of when you train the data and you collect data, and how much involvement do you have of the people training the systems or the people designing the systems, and then the other end, how much involvement and command do you have of the person that is actually using the system and exposed to the system. So there's a very practical side of this. And on the other hand, you have this kind of idea of, as I said before, transforming everything into data processes, and also in the sense having this independent kind of improvement of the human software that somehow will get us out of all of our problems, and then guiding innovation in this way. So I mean, it's not, when we talk about it in philosophical terms, it's very basically going back to understanding who we are as people and what role technologies plays in our life. But in very practical terms, it also means something about what we think on how we think we should build these technologies. And so I think it's not that philosophical. It's actually very, very practical. It's very, very practical, pushing back on this over datafication of everything, this thinking that there's a technical fix to everything in big crises where we think that we can get rid of a disease, an unpredictable disease that moves over the planet by installing one app or whatever. I mean, that's where we have to push back. We have to push back, so we have to regain our understanding of technology as a tool for us that helps us, a tool for democracy, for example. So, for example, power is a very kind of particular thing, and it's expressed in our institutions, but also in the technologies we build. And so when we build a technology, we're also building kind of tools of power that we give to institutions, or that we give away from ourselves as humans. No,
yes,
so
yes.
it's also about who we are as people.
Yeah.
Does Karen or Martin have thoughts also on this sort of?
Could see Karen jumping in here. I don't know. I was also though Martin would be interested to hear your take.
Man, I'll defer to you because I've had a go.
All right. Well, I also was inspired by another thing Gree said about that we as a society, we need to kind of decide of, what kind of society we want to live on, rather than have technology kind of lead the way and create the kind of society that we might not want to live in. And I think that is, since we are here in a gathering of cultural institutes, I think that is actually a nice opening for artists and philosophers and thinkers and humanists in really defining the terms of our contemporary world, of our contemporary culture. I think artists and thinkers can play an incredibly valuable role, and we've seen it in our grid project, where we've created the motto that you see behind me, that art powers technology, that we actually have this attempt to bring artists into not just the tech companies, but actually into the R&D labs, when these new products and these new services are designed, that we bring in artists, that we bring in philosophers, and often to the surprising results and surprising to the technologies, that it is not just about, moralizing and telling technologies how bad they are, but in some way expanding the imagination of what is actually possible. Because sometimes if you look into an R&D lab of a big tech company, where the where the individual technologist is just a very tiny wheel, in the big machinery, and the big machinery really is about a business model that is very inflexible and very kind of driven by this techno utilitarian mindset. The technology is actually quite happy when they are being able to talk to people about what the implications are, sometimes unintended implications, but also the possibility and the potential of that is. So I think. I think artists and also representatives of the humanities are actually very, very crucial in defining that kind of space and that kind of society we want to live in.
I mean, definitely, I think that's super important. And tomorrow, in fact, we will have a whole day that's dedicated to how AI is affecting and also impacting, but also the confluence between artists and education and AI and this digital shift. But one thing that I think does happen so often in these kinds of conversations is this idea that, okay, if we bring in artists and if we bring in philosophers, well, then it's going to be fine. And things are going to look more beautiful and the ideas behind them are going to be more just somehow. And there are two problems with that, which we will get into tomorrow. This is just a provocation of course, you're welcome to also respond. Oftentimes artists get put in the savior role, which of course is totally it's like antithetical to the role that artists usually are. They are provokers. They are ones who maybe they destroy the systems in order to make better systems. I know that's part of like the Silicon Valley ethics. But I also think that what we've seen in the past 20 years is actually artists and musicians losing their livelihoods due to these systems. And the value systems that these new platforms they do not include remuneration for the artist. And now, of course, it's more complicated because, art is always this thing that's like, it's very difficult to value. And it's valued due to popular traction and who interacts with it. And there's this whole complex, wetware problem of valuing art where it's very irrational. It's based in chaos. And so I really push back a little bit on just saying, okay, yes, we bring in artists, we bring in philosophers, and therefore it's all fine. And I'm not suggesting that you were saying that. I think that's just something that you sometimes hear in Silicon Valley. Well, our solution is look at our artist in residence. This person is making sure that we're okay. And it's a more complex problem than that. Anyway, I just want to insert that, but I also do, maybe you have a response, but also I know Karen too, whoever would like to speak next in response. I just wanted to insert that one qualification.
No, just to quick response. Absolutely, you're absolutely right. First of all, artists are artists and don't like to be and shouldn't be instrumentalized for whatever purpose. Also not for the purpose of saving us from whatever perils technology has in store for us. But I think what is definitely true from a Silicon Valley perspective is not so much only concerning artists, but in general, that is a very, very narrow focus on what these new technologies are meant for. And I think I brought in artists just as a pars pro toto of that society is much broader. The aspirations and the goals of society are much broader, and therefore we need to broaden. When we talk about human-centered, and really talking about our needs and our aspirations as human beings, and therefore artists or thinkers, but also members of society in general, of all different aspects of society, need to be brought into the early stages of these design processes, and not when already we are confronted with the consequences.
Absolutely. Yes. I think that's a great way of saying it. And again, to bring back in something we were saying yesterday, the original idea of techne is simply this extension of what the human desires. So it is always good to have a very plural set of humans who are expressing their desires when we're setting up these new systems. So yes, absolutely agree. Maybe Karen, do you have thoughts also that you'd like to share here?
I have to confess, I haven't given an enormous amount of thought to the cultural implications in terms of artists and creative providers. But one of the things that I have been struck by the way in which, artists' lives have been jeopardized by the rise of platform power, basically, and the capacity to scale the delivery of content, of creative content, in ways that basically cut the creator out of the process or cut them a very tiny share. And a lot of this is basically problems with the combined effect of the power of platform technologies together with capitalism and the instrumentalization of data in ways that doesn't really fully capture what it is that's valuable to us. So the result is that artists are getting cut out in ways that we wouldn't have tolerated when the technological capacity to scale and spread in the way that we have on platforms wasn't simply available. And I think there is a real challenge in terms of thinking about, again, and it comes back to these thorny questions about data governance, about, if you see it from a purely economic, from an economic perspective, that the unique qualities of data is it's copyable at almost no cost instantaneously. Mm-hmm. And that means that we see content spreading instantly around the world, and the value is not necessarily captured by the creator. And that is seriously problematic in the ways that you've already drawn attention to. We still haven't really wrestled with that one. So I think that's another one to put in the challenges of data governance problems that are looming really large, I think, in the present situation.
Absolutely. And also what kind of cultural institutions we set up to then take care of this culture that's being created. As a provocation, the sound for this program is also an AI generated sound, right? Of course, we had to do that thanks to Tim, who did help with our production. But yes, I mean, what is an institution? If it's is it only supporting the human creators? Is it somehow creating a space for this AI kind of production? And this is a question that we'll also be addressing tomorrow. But it does make us wonder what those institutions are. We have another question that comes in here through one other channel. And again, I will say for anyone listening, the Q&A, I always just want to point back to the Q&A interface within Zoom is the best way to submit a question. But so someone says, I am still interested in the role of the Global South here. And so maybe, let's see.
Although it is, they do
give
qualify that I know it's difficult for Europeans to talk on behalf of the Global South, but
I mean, I think maybe in terms of digital colonialism, there is a question here. I mean, and maybe does Europe feel somehow digitally colonized by American platforms, for instance? Has there been a shift in roles? One might think of how talking about human-centeredness and bringing in the question of migrancy ends up being a wedge against the digital colonization from Silicon Valley, or big tech in general. I know it's not only located in Silicon Valley, but maybe there are some thoughts on digital colonialism and I hope that was the implication of this question.
Yeah, and outwardly a colonialism of computational thinking, I think, in general.
Exactly. So what are these new forms of colonization that are happening? Maybe in unexpected ways, the US colonizing Europe and the rest of the world, but also the data sets being trained, of course. I mean, what is the thing? Siri is trained on
the Enron scandal emails from the early 2000s, right?
Which is pretty incredible. But maybe you have some thoughts on that. Maybe this is a Greek question first, but also whoever wants to jump in.
Yeah, it's a big, very, very big question. I actually don't know how to answer it. But I mean, in general, I think the way we have to look at it is, I think the term colonialism is a kind of good term, because it implies that it's not only, you know, a material space being occupied, but also this kind of cultural space of meanings and the way we do things and the kind of unsaid habits we have. And of course, I mean, if we want to think about, you know, how this the kind of the digital space, but which is generally also socio-technical in many ways, so it's embedded in our cultures and environments, then we have had a dominance of a very particular way of doing things, and a kind of colonialism that has kind of expanded into the very innovative practices of doing things. So this thing of, as we have as we talked about before, moving fast, breaking things, collecting data until you drop. And I mean, I remember it very, very clearly from the early days when I used to try to convince people at tech conferences that, as I said before, that privacy, for example, is a good idea, that there was this kind of mindset and this, I mean, the space was colonized by this obsession with we have to collect all data, we have to digitalize everything. Also in my own environment, coming from actually a Scandinavian state where they were totally up for the digitalization of every single service, every single agency, and where we would have, you know, old elderly people or people that couldn't catch up, falling behind. So in that sense, we can talk about colonialism, but we can also talk about, you know, pushing back on it. And I think there's a positive movement at the moment. Does that kind of answer the question? I'm not sure if I'm answering.
I also think the question was more generally where in the map of this conversation does the Global South fit in? The conversational map, in which way is it? I guess in what position does it sit as being influenced or having influence?
Or providing value? You mean providing a data set, not providing a data set? Or
yeah, I mean, where does it fit in the conversation, in the map of how this AI and machine learning and tech is emerging?
What role does it play?
Right.
Mm-hmm. Maybe Karen wants to, or Martin. Yeah.
Sure, so I'm happy to jump in there. I think the Global South is already being pretty significantly drawn in to these geopolitical dynamics that are going on. And one of the things that is often hidden in the whole ideology of seamlessness that is promoted by the tech industry is that we can take the human out of the loop and the machines can do the dirty work. When actually a lot of the dirty work, the mindless dirty work of labeling the cat pictures and distinguishing them from the dog pictures, and in filtering out some filthy content that shouldn't be on platforms, is simply contracted out to people who were paid pittance in the Global South. It's just that it's hidden from contemporary Western tastes so that we can pretend to ourselves that machines do this all by themselves. And in fact, they don't, and they can't, because they aren't actually capable of distinguishing in cat and dog pictures until a human has been through and labeled a data set of cat and dog pictures, so that the machine then learns, derived from the human insight that has gone into spotting what's a cat and what's a dog and what's content that shouldn't be available for public view and so on and so forth. So there is this kind of what Aristotle calls faux automation. It pretends to be automation, but in fact what's happened is a huge amount of human labor has simply been hidden from view and placed somewhere where it can be done more cheaply, with very little, with no attention to labor standards whatsoever. So I think that's a really serious problem, and the rising precariat we see, but then not just in the Global South, but this logic of, you know, just-in-time labor to meet supply and demand in this really responsive way, is also affecting the way in which we ensure the protection of basic labor standards here in the West as well. So this, I think, is a really disturbing kind of business model that is powering the way in which the technology industry seeks to capitalize on the technology, and it's a kind of inevitable logic of unrestrained capitalism, if you like. So I think that's one way in which the Global South is currently implicated. But I also see, at least in anecdotal discussions, that tech sees the Global South as the next virgin frontier. So there are a lot of resources there, and there is a lot of money to be made if we can just get in there early, because in fact the legal infrastructure is often very weak. And so everything is up for grabs. And I think this is really troubling, and there needs to be some safeguards to try and push back against, you know, exploiting what one can, because there is no pushback. And I think that's a really serious danger which is facing the Global South, but not to deny that, of course, you know, there are many problems with being under-resourced, you know, and lacking some critical institutional governance infrastructure that could provide some form of protection against, unjust exploitation.
Yeah, you already see many of the devices that people will use in more precarious zones are preloaded with Facebook. And so you access the internet via these platforms. That is your frame for the world. Also adding to this conversation, although I'm interested now to hear Martin's response, are some of the other externalities of global supply of AI, both the end devices when they are no longer useful, and also, of course, the mining of the core minerals. A lot of that is also happening in these zones. But Martin, perhaps you have further thoughts on this and how diplomacy can be extended to areas outside of the EU and US.
Yes, I think one of the problems you also encounter is that when we talk about colonialism, we usually think of nation states dominating other nation states, and of course, in the case of the global tech industry, you also find that our nation states itself sees itself challenged in our democratic institutions, for example, in Europe, but even in the United States, is challenged by some of the developments of global tech platforms. There's been just a recent documentary coming out actually right out of Silicon Valley, The Social Dilemma, that was seen by millions of people on Netflix, really talking about the effects of social media on our societies. It was really a very US centric debate, and I think what some of the challenges when we talk about governance of technology is the question of how do you then include the aspirations of the entire world and the entire globe. Are the existing global governance structures like the United Nations, are they equipped to these global governance questions, when we already as European countries, as the European Union, sometimes find it so hard to find the right responses to regulating and shaping these new technologies. There's been a number of initiatives coming from the United Nations to be more inclusive, to include the Global South in these debates by the United Nations Secretary General. There are a lot of efforts going on in Geneva from the ITU. But the question really is, how do we, in reality, reconcile this aspect of globalization and the global tech industry that transcends national borders, sometimes undermines our traditional democratic institutions, with also this additional question of this global imbalance that we see.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, on the flip side, one can also imagine how necessary this cooperation will be to any kind of climate preparedness. And I know somewhat problematically, the WEF has already talked about the Great Reset, and that was trending yesterday on Twitter. There's a lot of miscommunication as to what that is. At the same time, we see this kind of global class separation of, the World Bank is saying that it solved poverty or nearly solved poverty, whatever that exactly is supposed to mean. But you meanwhile have this gig economy class that sees no way of getting out of this very pernicious economic cycle. Then you see maybe a managerial class who's coding, and then you see tech overlords, the Elon Musks, and the separation between these classes is very, very big. And it's not a problem that you could imagine any one nation solving, given that these companies are, I don't know, they're tax sheltered in different European zones or islands. And it seems like a very, very messy regulation space. I wonder if maybe actually speaking about encryption would make sense as a last question.
Well, your question's a bit different if you wanted people to respond to that.
I guess I meant in terms of like areas of regulation, areas of encryption, there being some kind of common policy, and how very messy that is, given that we have a kind of global governance now by these platforms.
Well, they change life on almost the levels of physics or something. They
right.
change the way that we live life,
our
and society is organized entirely.
Exactly.
It's just difficult to regulate something that it has changes on that macro level.
Right. I mean, at least in the United States, we know that like the platforms had more influence on the politics and the political outlets than government itself.
Yeah. If there was going to, you could respond to that, but I also wanted to mention one thing, which is that I believe there's the EU Council of Ministers is planning on perhaps passing a resolution that would require a sort of backdoor to end-to-end encryption for messaging apps and things like that. I wonder, what your feelings are on encryption as a right, and if you do think, or do you agree that it's a space that, responsible states, if it could even be handled with any sort of absolute, should have a backdoor in certain cases to end-to-end encryption, or if you consider encryption is a right for all?
I don't know that any of us want to jump in there. So just let me clarify. I don't believe, at least my understanding of the encryption debate in Europe, which is, as you say, really hot right now. I haven't actually heard a proposal to build backdoors. I've heard people talking about it, but I haven't actually seen a proposal within the Council of Ministers. And in fact, my understanding is that the European Union is most anxious to avoid hostility with the tech industry. So it's trying to build a kind of consensus way forward in cooperation with what will hopefully be a responsible approach by industry. So I just want to clarify that I'm not aware of an actual backdoor proposal being on the table in Europe at the moment. Secondly, I think this, the encryption problem, as you put it, is actually in many ways a really nice illustration of the challenge to govern technology responsibly. So the whole, if I put it in very simple terms, the debate about the appropriate balance between privacy and security on the one hand, and transparency, accountability on the rule of law, we have had that since we have had civilization. And we have long accepted that democratic communities require both. We need some degree of privacy, but not absolute privacy, because that fosters organized crime and child pornography and all those other things that are against the law. And so we accept that law enforcement agencies should have a legitimate right to investigate where there is adequate basis for suspicion, where we think there are serious breaches of the law occurring. The principle is straightforward. The application in an encrypted world is a thorny one. And that's the challenge, the interaction between the technological capacity, which is run ahead of our democratic norms, and the foundational need for a context-specific balance between those vital principles in our democratic institutions, and how we bring the tech industry on board to do that responsibly and lawfully. That is the challenge.
Well said. Thank you, Karen. I think there's one last question that maybe we could ask, and maybe this is a question for Martin, although Gry, also if you had something that you wanted to say in here, there's also some space for you to say it. Simply, what role could European culture institutions play in providing a space of thinking through this, some kind of haven for thinking through this? What role simply do you see them playing in this discussion going forward?
So I think that European cultural institutions, have a huge role to play potentially. And I think if we look how European cultural institutions have evolved over the last years, from 20 years ago, showcasing national cultures in foreign lands to a much more collaborative approach in bringing people together, and finding common grounds. If you apply that kind of principle to technology, I think particularly at a time where we're living in a global pandemic that has seen also national borders come up again, and separating not just artists but people from each other. I think cultural institutes, with our networks that we have across the globe, I think we can on the one hand, use technology to bringing people back together, and that on the one hand, on the other hand, opening these discussions, where we bring, as we say, all stakeholders, all relevant people together. And if I think of our project, The Grid, which is really has as its mission and as its core to bring these, as we say, often siloed debates of art and technology together, and then even include, the space of policy making and regulation into the picture as well. It's not easy, but on the other hand, I think that cultural institutes are often trusted partners from all sides. So that's a very positive experience we have made, and it certainly is a very invigorating experience, to enter also a new territory and meet, in a sense, a demand for dialogue and a demand for collaboration that is already on the ground.
Absolutely. I mean, and it sounds like cultural institutions can be a space, maybe not exactly outside of capitalism, but at least outside of its direct demands for quarterly returns and whatnot, and a relatively non-competitive space to share across these different stacks and corporate spaces. Yes, they can be a kind of civic space.
Does Gree want to leave us with any?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. So we're about to close out this panel. And in a second, we're going to invite everybody to join us on wander.me, which is like our informal space. But maybe, Gree, do you have any closing remarks on maybe is there even one or two things that we can take away today to keep in mind as we're building communities online?
I think we can be a little, I would like to leave with a little bit of optimism and positive, like a positive statement. And so, I mean, as I said before, we've done this before, and there's always been like competing interests in technological change. And somehow we always managed, even though we don't have perfect, for example, we think about cars and the kind of environment, we don't have perfect cars and we don't have electric cars on the streets, but we did manage to kind of change from having these big polluting things in the 1970s to having something a little bit different today. And so I think that we are in a positive movement right now where there are the right forces at place. And so if we kind of support these kind of forces in creating this human-centric approach to technologies and shaping and framing the practices that are shaping these technical environments that we're building, then we will also achieve what we usually do in other areas. But still with the risk that there'll always be things that are not perfect. So.
Fair enough. Thank you, Gree Hasselbalch. Thank you, Martin Rauchbauer. And thank you, Karen Yeung.
Thank you.
This has been an incredibly informative panel. And also thank you to Catherine Jarmul for your keynote, helping us all understand what the basis of machine learning, otherwise known maybe spuriously as artificial intelligence, is.